There is a particular kind of moment that arrives without warning and without ceremony. Not a plan, not a decision, not anything you could have pointed to in advance and said, "This is where it starts." It announces itself only in retrospect, years later, when you trace a line back through everything that happened and find it converging, inevitably, on one quiet evening in a house in South Wales, and a sound coming through a radio that made a woman sit perfectly still and forget, for 3 full minutes, that she was already famous. She was 26 years old. She had already been on American radio. She had already stood in rooms full of people who knew every word of her chorus. She had already done the thing most singers spend entire careers trying to do. And yet she sat in that room, listening to someone else's song, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. The sensation of hearing a voice and thinking, that, whatever that is, whatever that costs, whatever it takes to get there. She had no way of knowing yet that getting there was going to take 5 years, 2 rejections, and 1 sentence that changed everything. By the autumn of 1977, It's a Heartache was everywhere. It had climbed to number 3 on the American Billboard Hot 100, selling in numbers that Bonnie Tyler's South Wales circuit days could not have prepared her for. She had toured America for the first time, stood in venues in cities she'd only ever seen on maps, heard her own voice playing back to her in California diners and hotel lobbies and radio stations whose call signs she couldn't pronounce. It was, by every external measure, the thing she had been working toward since those early Tuesday nights in working men's clubs that nobody remembered now except her. The tour had been its own kind of disorientation. America was louder than she had expected and far more certain of itself. Every city had the same motorway diners, the same radio formats, the same sequence of questions and interviews that all assumed she had arrived fully formed from somewhere exotic rather than from a terraced house in Skewen. She answered those questions politely, the way she answered most things, and went back to the tour bus and ate crisps she'd brought from home because nothing in the American service stations tasted right. She was not unhappy about it. She was clear-eyed about it, which is a different thing entirely. Success at 26 after the years she'd put in was not something she was inclined to take for granted. She knew what an empty room felt like, and she knew what a full one felt like, and she understood that the distance between them was not luck so much as accumulated effort that nobody else had been counting. But there is a gap that opens up sometimes between what success looks like from the outside and what it feels like from the inside. And by 1977, Bonnie Tyler was becoming quietly familiar with that gap. The label that had signed her was pleased. Radio programmers were pleased. Charts were moving in the right direction. The machine was working exactly as machines are designed to work. The trouble was the sound. The sound that the machine kept producing, warm, country-tinged, radio-friendly, pleasant, was not the sound she heard when she lay awake at night and thought about what her voice could actually do. There was something rawer underneath it, something bigger. Something that matched the torn, smoky quality that had emerged from her voice in the aftermath of her surgery, and that no amount of tasteful production had yet fully reached. She knew what she was. The question nobody around her could answer was what kind of music that was supposed to be. She was at home in South Wales the evening it happened. Robert was nearby. He was usually nearby. A fact that would come to seem in later years like the most significant and least celebrated detail of her biography. The house was quiet in the way Welsh houses can be quiet on an autumn evening. The kind of quiet that makes the radio feel more present than it usually does. The program was BBC, late enough in the schedule to take chances. The kind of slot that in the 1970s occasionally broadcast music that hadn't yet been approved by the consensus of the industry. And then, without preamble or introduction that she would later be able to remember, the opening bars of something began. She recognized nothing about it. That was the first thing. She had heard thousands of records by then, on tour buses and studios in the specific half-attentive way that working musicians hear music when it's always around them. She thought she knew broadly what was on offer. She thought she had a sense of the shape of things. Bat Out of Hell did not have the shape of things. It had the shape of a force of nature pretending to be a pop song, orchestral, enormous, theatrical in a way that pop music of that era rarely allowed itself to be. Meat Loaf's voice was something she had never heard before, operatic and desperate and physically overwhelming, the kind of voice that sounded like it was costing him something real just to produce it. And underneath everything, driving it, shaping it into something that felt less like a record and more like an event, a songwriter's architecture so specifically and defiantly itself that it seemed to come from a completely different set of rules than the ones the music industry generally handed out. She did not move for the duration of it, Robert noticed. He noticed the way you notice when someone you've lived with for 4 years goes suddenly still in a way that means something has reached them that doesn't reach them often. When it ended, she didn't immediately speak. She sat with the silence that followed it, the particular silence of a room where something large has just finished happening. Then she asked Robert the same question. The only question. Who made that? Jim Steinman was not, in 1977, a household name. He was a composer and theatrical obsessive from New York who had spent the better part of his 20s staging rock musicals for a fringe theater company and writing songs of such cinematic scale that the mainstream pop industry had for years largely declined to engage with them. He had found his collaborator in Meat Loaf, a singer physically and emotionally built to carry the weight of what Steinman put on the page, and together they had made Bat Out of Hell, an album that the major labels had passed on repeatedly before finally being released, spreading first through word of mouth, then through radio play that nobody had planned for, and then into a phenomenon that had sold, by 1977, in numbers that made the labels who'd passed on it wish they hadn't. Bonnie Tyler learned all of this gradually. She was not the kind of person who made her interest known immediately and loudly. She was a coal miner's daughter, and the valleys did not produce people who announced their desires before they'd thought them through. She sat with the question of Jim Steinman the way she sat with most important questions, quietly, for a long time, turning it over, testing its weight. She kept coming back to the same answer. The voice that had come out of that surgery, rough and torn and unlike anything else on the radio, was built for exactly the kind of material he wrote. She didn't have language for why she knew this. She just knew it the way she'd known, at 16, standing on a pub stage in Neath, that she was not a backing singer. But knowing something and reaching it, in the music industry, are two entirely different problems. The years between 1977 and 1982 were not empty. She recorded, she toured, she released albums that charted with varying degrees of success in different territories. She maintained a career that most singers would have been grateful for, and she maintained it without complaint, because complaining had never been her style and because the work itself, standing on a stage, opening her mouth, watching rooms respond, never lost its pull. The label had her making pleasant music, and she made it professionally and without obvious resistance, which was its own form of discipline. She had learned, on the South Wales circuit, that you did not get to the room you wanted by refusing to play the rooms you had. A backing singer doesn't walk to the front of the stage the first night she feels ready for it. She walks there when the room is finally prepared to see her standing there. She understood timing in that particular way, not as passivity, but as the very precise management of when to push and when to let the situation develop at its own pace. But the question of Jim Steinman never left her. It was there on the tour buses and in the hotel rooms and in the recording sessions, where she sang what she was given as well as she could while knowing, with the certainty of someone who had been living inside her own voice for long enough to understand its dimensions, that it was built for something larger than this. She brought Steinman up where she could, with managers, with industry contacts, with anyone who might be in a position to help her find a door into that particular room. The response was usually some variation of the same gentle discouragement. He worked with Meat Loaf. He was particular. He probably wouldn't be interested. She had heard variations of that particular sentence before. It had never, in her experience, turned out to be the end of a story. By 1981, she had signed with CBS and found a new A&R man in Muff Winwood, a veteran of the industry whose instincts she trusted and whose patience she had already tested with the persistence of her interest in Steinman. Muff Winwood was, by most accounts, a pragmatic and steady presence in a business that rewarded pragmatism. He had heard stranger requests than the one she was about to make, but none, perhaps, that were delivered quite so steadily. She went into his office and told him what she wanted. She told him clearly and without preamble, the way she told people most things, that she wanted to make a record with Jim Steinman. Muff Winwood's reaction was, by her own later account, somewhere between alarm and disbelief. Steinman was not a producer who collected clients. He was not looking for a Welsh pop singer. He had never produced anything that sounded like what she had been making. There was no obvious reason why this should work, and at least several obvious reasons why it shouldn't. She looked at him and said, "I just want you to ask him." Winwood asked. Steinman said no. She told Winwood to ask again. What changed Steinman's mind was not a phone call or a meeting or a favor called in between industry contacts. It was a cassette tape, a collection of demos she put together herself, reaching past the country pop recordings the label had released and toward the harder, more rock-inflected material she'd been privately developing for years. She sent it to him directly, without a covering letter full of persuasion. She let the tape speak for itself, which was, if you thought about it, a very Bonnie Tyler approach to a very Bonnie Tyler problem. He called back. He was, by most accounts, not immediately enthusiastic. He was curious, which was different, and which was enough. He agreed to meet her. He would not commit to anything beyond that. He would meet her, and they would see. She flew to New York. The apartment was exactly what you might expect of a man who wrote songs about the apocalypse and called them pop records. Sheet music on every surface, a piano at the center of it, the atmosphere of someone who worked at all hours and cleaned at no particular ones. Steinman received her with the wary courtesy of a man who had already said no once and was still not entirely sure why he'd agreed to this. He did not ask her about her career. He did not play her any of his own material. Instead, he sat down at the piano and played her music he loved, Creedence Clearwater Revival, the particular ache of John Fogerty's voice against a simple chord structure, a track by Blue Oyster Cult. He watched her face while she listened. She didn't perform a reaction. She simply had one. The particular quality of attention that happens when music does something to you that you didn't plan for. He saw it. He had spent enough time around singers to know the difference between an enthusiast and a listener, and what he was watching was a listener. He agreed to make the album. Neither of them yet knew which song would define it. But the song had been waiting for longer than either of them realized. Total Eclipse of the Heart had existed, in various forms, since before either of them were recording artists. Steinman had written the first version of its melody as a teenager, a song for a high school rock musical he had staged himself, built around his long-standing obsession with vampire mythology and desperate love. He had revisited it over the years, reshaping it each time, never quite finishing it because he had never quite found the voice it deserved. He played it for her at the piano during the early days of their sessions. He simply played it, the way he played everything, as though the song already existed completely and he was merely locating it in real time. She felt it immediately. She described it in later interviews as shivers, not metaphorical ones, but the physical variety, starting at the base of her spine and moving upward. She told him she wanted to record it before she'd heard the whole thing. He told her to wait until he'd finished playing. She waited. Then she said yes. The full weight of what she had just agreed to would only become apparent to her inside the recording booth, 6 months later, with 64 tracks of sound building around her and Jim Steinman watching through the glass. The sessions took place at the power station in New York, across 1982 and into 1983. The musicians around her were the ones Steinman trusted with his grandest arrangements. Roy Bittan on piano, Max Weinberg on drums. She learned the songs beside Steinman at the piano, in real time, with no demos to fall back on. Take after take, 9 times per song on average, listened to at home overnight on a cassette she carried back to the hotel room, reconsidered in the quiet, brought back the following morning with notes. There were sessions that ran until the early hours of the morning. The desk's 64 tracks filled past the point that anyone had thought to plan for, Steinman adding layers of sound, choir, organ, a synthesizer patch engineered to sound like cannon fire, reverb treatments that seemed to push the walls of the studio slightly further apart, and Bonnie absorbing all of it, adjusting her approach around each new element, finding where her voice needed to sit inside the architecture. She had spent years singing into the middle of arrangements designed to showcase her. This was different. This was a collaboration in the fullest sense, a songwriter who built mountains, and a singer who knew, instinctively, how to make a mountain feel inhabited. Total Eclipse of the Heart was recorded on the second take. She sang it as though the lyrics were not someone else's construction but her own memory. The engineer stepped back from the desk at one point and simply listened. Steinman in the control room said nothing during the playback. When it finished, he said that her performance had been like an exorcism, that she had brought to the song something he hadn't known to ask for, which was the sound of a person who had actually lived through the kind of darkness the song was built around. He had written the architecture. She had made it breathe. The label, when they heard the finished track, were not immediately certain what to do with it. 6 minutes and 58 seconds was not a radio single. The drama of it, the sheer number of moving parts, choir, canon synth, organ, the wall of reverb that had burned through every track on the desk, was not what radio programmers had been trained to embrace. They were told it was too much. The world disagreed. Total Eclipse of the Heart went to #1 in the United States, the United Kingdom, and across most of Europe. It sold 13 million copies. Every time a solar eclipse was announced anywhere on the planet, a new generation found it, and it climbed the charts again. The morning after it first hit #1, she rang Robert from New York. The conversation was, by her later account, not very long. He already knew. He'd been following the charts the way he followed all of it. Quietly, from the same house in Wales where they'd heard Meat Loaf's record come through the radio 6 years earlier. That detail, the same house, the same man, the beginning and the arrival connected by a single thread of constancy, was one she carried for the rest of her life. There is a coda to this story, and it belongs to Meat Loaf. When Bonnie Tyler and Meat Loaf eventually crossed paths, he told her, with the directness of a man who felt genuinely wronged, that Total Eclipse of the Heart had been written for him, that Steinman had always intended it for his voice, that it should have been his. She listened. Then she said, "Tough, I've got it." It was not said cruelly. It was said the way a coal miner's daughter says things, flatly, without decoration, as a statement of fact rather than a triumph. The song was hers. She had spent 5 years finding her way to the man who wrote it, driven by a single evening in a South Wales house and a question she had refused to stop asking. The voice the world heard in that recording was the same voice she had been carrying, patiently, through every club and tour bus and label meeting, since before anyone outside of Wales had known her name. Robert Sullivan had been there for all of it. He had been in the room when the radio changed the direction of everything. He had been there through 5 years of quiet, steady persistence. He had been there the morning after the charts confirmed what neither of them had quite let themselves believe. A voice like hers does not come from nowhere. It comes from a specific place, a specific life, a specific set of decisions made quietly over a long time by a woman who knew what she wanted and went after it with a patience that looked, from the outside, like nothing in particular, until the day it looked, to the entire world, like everything. There is a version of this story that presents the whole chain of events as a stroke of luck. The right BBC broadcast on the right evening, a radio that happened to be on, a woman who happened to be listening. That version is not wrong exactly. It simply leaves out everything that made the luck useful when it arrived. The 5 years of persistence, the cassette tape sent without a covering letter, the 2 refusals absorbed without complaint, the sentence said twice, to the same man, with exactly the same steady tone. Luck finds a room. It cannot decide on its own who is ready for what it brings. She had been ready for a long time. The voice that came out of that 1976 surgery, the one the specialist said she'd ruined, the one the radio engineers couldn't quite categorize, the one that stopped working men's clubs cold before anyone had a name for what it was doing, had been waiting for exactly the material Jim Steinman wrote. It had known, before she could articulate it, that it needed more room than pleasant country pop records could give it. It had been carrying the shape of something larger since before she could have explained to anyone what that shape was. Hearing Bat Out of Hell that autumn evening in South Wales didn't give her the voice. It gave her the direction. It showed her the coordinates of a place she had already been trying to reach without a map. It started with a radio. It ended with an eclipse. And the 5 years in between belonged entirely to her.